Okay, come in, you know, darling, that no one can against me. You know, we're in the air with me. That is what you can have, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have them all after me, but they can't with me. That is what you can have, of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I have to rescue my kids, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are there, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm with baby died, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm with the Kia here, of course, darling, that is what you can have. But they are the whole time after me, trying to poison me and things like those, of course, darling, I have to clean the mess they do. Of course, darling, but I'm gonna blow myself on the top of the mountain and I'm gonna give it them. That is what you can have, of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I come with my red dragon with the heart, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that is what you can see. That no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna blow myself on the top of the mountain, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are the whole time recycling around me to get my honey, of course, darling, that is what you can have. They wanna climb the mountain with me, but they can't, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, that I'm on the top, and from the top I'm not gonna fall. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna blow myself on the top of the mountain, that is what you can have. And no one can against me, and I'm gonna forget about them, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling. Of course, darling, we're in a time full of war, of course, darling, the Cold War and the Holy War everywhere, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're killing each other, of course, darling, that is what you can have, and the only thing I want is don't feel hurt by anyone, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have the atomic bomb here, of course, darling, that is what you can have, and no one can against me, of course, darling, I'm gonna blow them all out with my mic. That is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna blow myself on the top of the mountain and no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I know how to move and no one can against me. I'm gonna forget about all them, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm a pacifist, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me and that I believe in everything, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I believe in peace, but I don't believe in things they are doing, of course, darling, that is what you can have. I don't know if I should do what I do, but okay, darling, I have to. That is what you can have. That I'm gonna forget about them, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That I come with everything I can, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That they are after me, but they can't, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That I'm gonna blow myself on the top of the mountain and I'm gonna give it them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they all want to die and be the cross, Medellin, that everyone gives his hearts to them, and that the fathers are the fathers of their own sons. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That is what they want. They want to adjust a fabric and things like those. Of course, darling, I don't believe in that. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That touch my money and make my money sound. Of course, darling, and I like it like that. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. It's a lifestyle and the lifestyle works and I'm happy and everything. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I love my life, of course. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm gonna blow myself in the top of the mountain. Of course, darling, I have that dummy bomb and I'm gonna blow them all out. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. You know, don't save no one, because if you save someone, you're gonna think on when you have something of your own in Rome. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't save no one, and like that I'm gonna keep. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, and like that I'm gonna stay. Of course, darling, I have the atomic bomb, and I'm gonna blow them all out. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and like that I'm gonna keep. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, and so I'm gonna work. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna forget about all them, and I'm gonna ride, and I'm gonna feel fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So what are you gonna say? Of course, darling, many kids trying to jump into my car. Of course, darling, that they have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, and I gave my boys golden rings so they don't have to feel safer with them. Of course, darling, and the kids wanna jump into my car. Of course, darling, that you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I have the atomic bomb and I'm gonna blow them all out. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And don't save no one, because if you save someone, you're gonna sing on and you have something of your own in Rome. Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, that I'm gonna set everything on fire. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, that I have the atomic bomb and I'm gonna blow them all out. Of course, darling, I want peace. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, do you want to be the cross middle in Holy Land? Of course, darling. But okay, what can you do against them? Just nothing. Just tell them that I don't wanna be stepfather of my own kids, that I don't wanna be Joseph. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, I don't wanna be Joseph, that is what you can get, and I don't want a Joseph fabric. Of course, darling, I love to touch my money and make it sound. Of course, darling, it's a lifestyle and it works. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I don't wanna be Joseph. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and like that I'm gonna keep. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna blow them all out, that I have the atomic bomb, and I'm gonna blow them all out. Of course, darling, and don't save no one. Of course, darling, because if you save someone, you're gonna sing on and you have something of your own in Rome. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, so go on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And let me cross sending on, shooting at the devil too. Of course, darling, but they think that when they confess, all their sins are gonna be forgiven. Of course, but when you save someone, you're gonna sing on when you have something of your own in Rome. So we are in the same place. And of course, that is what you can get, so let them. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm with the cage at 9 o'clock, and like that I'm gonna keep. Of course, darling, so go on.